Go ahead and turn to the book of Genesis chapter 13. And before we pick up where we left off, let me give you a quick synopsis of what's happened up to this point. As you know, Abraham and Lot went to Egypt in order to escape the famine. And while they were there, Abraham told a lie. He said that Sarah was his sister. And the reason that he told the lie is because Sarah must have been a beautiful, beautiful woman. Because she's above 65 years old, but Abraham says, "You are so good looking. The Egyptian men will kill me in order to be able to take you." Well, one thing led to another, and before Abraham knew it, Pharaoh heard about Sarah, and he came in and he took her to be his wife. But thank God, he intervened. Before Pharaoh had a chance to consummate the marriage, God sent a plague upon Pharaoh and all of his house, and in the process, Pharaoh found out that Abraham had lied, and that Sarah was not his sister, Sarah was his wife. So as you can imagine, Pharaoh was very ticked off at Abraham. So he gave Sarah back to Abraham, and he commanded Abraham to leave. He said, "Just pack up your things and go." Now, Pharaoh had made Abraham a very wealthy man. He was a rich man when he actually left and went to Canaan, but he wasn't what we would consider a very, very wealthy man. Well, Pharaoh made Abraham a very wealthy man. You see, when he took Sarah to be his wife, he gave Abraham some expensive gifts, including livestock, which made him very wealthy. And the interesting thing is, Pharaoh allowed Abraham to keep all of the gifts that he'd given him, even after he found out that Abraham had lied, and he returned Sarah to him. Now, the reason Pharaoh did that is because he was scared of God. If God could send a plague upon his house, and upon him personally, what would God do if he took these gifts back? So he allowed Abraham to keep that. So Abraham left Egypt a very wealthy man, and so did Lot, because Abraham was a very generous man. We see that as we go through the book of Genesis. And because he was so generous, he shared a lot of the wealth with Lot. Now, verse 6 in Genesis chapter 13 tells us that they had so much livestock that the land could not sustain the both of them. So they had to split up and go their own way. Now, the whole purpose of this story in Genesis chapter 13 is to show you the difference between Abraham's character and Lot's. And right off the bat, we see the difference. You see, as the uncle in the eldest, it was his right to choose which land he wanted. It was his choice, not Lot's. But for the sake of the relationship, and in order to keep peace in the family, he gave up that right, and he allowed Lot to choose. And Lot's choice showed just how greedy and how selfish and how foolish he really was. He chose to live in the vicinity of Sodom, and eventually he ended up living inside of the city. And that's what we looked at last week. Now, tonight we're going to finish chapter 13, and then hopefully we're going to go into chapter 14 and finish it also. And we're going to see what a godly man that Abraham really was. So turn to verse number 18. It's the last verse in Genesis chapter 13. It says, "Then Abram moved his tent and came and dwelt by the oaks of Mamre, which are in Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord." Now, if you remember, I told you that the Canaanites and the Perizzites were farmers. That meant that they lived in the valleys. But Hebron is in the Judean hill country. And that's a very important detail because living in the hill country of Hebron meant that Abraham had limited interaction with the Canaanites. In other words, it allowed him to occasionally interact with the Canaanites without having to assimilate and become a part of them. And that was a very wise thing to do, and it's a good lesson for us. It's something that we can apply to our life. You see, living in the world like we do means that we're going to have to associate with some ungodly people from time to time. We can't help it. It's just a part of life. If you want to be in this world, you are going to be around ungodly people from time to time. And the Bible recognizes that. And so it's interesting as to what Paul writes in the book of 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter, verses 9 through 11, because what he's doing is he is addressing the problem of sin in the church. And what he's telling the church to do in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 is to kick this man out who has had an incestuous relationship with his mother. So he says you need to kick him out, and then he begins to explain certain principles about what we have to do since we live in this world. So turn with me, if you would, to the book of 1 Corinthians, the 5th chapter. I want to read verses 9 through 11, and I want you to notice that the Bible recognizes that we are going to have to associate with ungodly people. Notice what it says. When I wrote to you before, I told you not to associate with people who indulge in sexual sin. But I wasn't talking about unbelievers who indulge in sexual sin, or are greedy, or cheat people, or worship idols. You would have to leave the world to avoid people like that. Now, do you notice what Paul is saying? He's saying that, when I told you not to associate with people who were involved in sexual immorality, I wasn't talking about unbelievers. Because if I was talking about unbelievers, you couldn't associate with anyone. And then he goes further. I meant that you are not to associate with anyone who claims to be a believer, yet indulges in sexual sin, or is greedy, or worship idols, or is abusive, or is a drunkard, or cheats people. Don't even eat with such people. You see, Paul understood that you couldn't go anywhere or do anything if you had to stop associating with ungodly people. Why? Because they're everywhere. But there's always a but, right? But that doesn't mean you're supposed to run around with them and start hanging out with them. Because if you start doing that, it won't be long before you start acting like them. Turn to 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse number 33. Don't be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. Now, how many of you heard that from your mother? Remember growing up and they would say, don't run with them. Bad company corrupts good morals. And what she probably didn't know, and maybe what you didn't know, was that's biblical. The Scripture says don't be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. And there it is in black and white. It's not just an old wives' tale. If you start running around with people, what was the old saying? I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't chew, and I don't kiss girls who do, or something like that. But anyways, if you start running with people who do things that is scripturally wrong, it won't be long before you're participating in that. Now, when it comes back to Abraham and Lot, the biggest difference between those two was that Abraham knew the value of boundaries. He knew the value of boundaries. He knew that he was going to have to associate with the ungodly Canaanites from time to time. But he had clear-cut boundaries. He lived in the mountains. They lived in the valleys. That's why many times we use that as a figure of speech. We talk about living on the mountaintops. Basically, this goes back to Abraham in the story of Genesis. He lived in the mountains. They lived in the valleys. God expects us to live in the mountaintops. Yes, Abraham had contact with them from time to time, and he even made alliances with some of them, which we'll see in chapter 14. But he didn't live with them. He didn't become a part of them. There were clear-cut boundaries, and that's a lesson that God wants us to learn. When I was in high school, a lot of the football players in my grade took drugs. They smoked dope. I didn't. Now, I knew from a very young age that if I ran around with them, if I went out to the parties with them, then I would be smoking dope too. So I didn't go out with them on weekends, and I didn't party with them. In fact, what I started doing was actually running with a group of kids from a grade lower than mine. And the reason I did that was because I understood that if I hung out with them and I went to the same parties that they went to, then I would start smoking dope. And I could have run with them, but I didn't do it. And I understood, and my parents understood that. In fact, we kind of know, and you know this too, living in a small town, you kind of know which kids are doing drugs and which kids aren't doing drugs. And let me just tell you, I know that the parents of the kids who are doing drugs want your kids to run around with them because they'll be a good influence. But let me just tell you something. It doesn't work that way. That good influence does not rub off on them. Their bad influence will rub off on your kids. And I want you to understand it works for adults just like it does with kids. Abraham established clear-cut boundaries. Lot didn't. Abraham was blessed, and he flourished, and he remained a very godly person. Lot, on the other hand, didn't. He eventually lost everything, and he actually lost his sense of what right and wrong was. Which brings us to chapter 14. Now, in chapter 14, Lot is going to pay the consequences for the choices that he's made. He was captured by an invading army, and he was carried into captivity. And good old Uncle Abe, he's there once more, and he's going to have to bail him out. He's going to have to come to his rescue. Now, if you don't mind, I just kind of want to tell you the story, just kind of sum it up for you, and then we're going to look at the details as we go through it, if you don't mind. In the time of Abraham, most cities had their own kings. And what I mean by that is they were considered to be city-states. In other words, you didn't have very many kings that ruled over several cities. No, each little city was technically their own city-state, and they all had their own kings, and these kings would form alliances. And the reason they would form alliances is because kings from other areas would form alliances, and they would come in and they would do battle. So each little city had their own king. And there were several cities around the Dead Sea, and what we find is that they each had their own king and they had formed an alliance. Now, Sodom, along with 4 other cities in the region, were subservient to the king of Elam. That means that they had to pay an annual tribute to him, and they had faithfully done this for 12 years. Now, we don't know exactly when Lot went to live inside the city of Sodom, but we know that it was sometime during this 12-year period. He became a part of the city and began living inside of the city while they were paying tribute. But in the 13th year, these 5 cities decided that they weren't going to pay tribute anymore. They decided that we're going to rebel. We're not going to do that. Look at verse number 4. It says, for 12 years they had been subject to King Chedorlaomer, but in the 13th year they rebelled against him. So the king of Elam, along with 3 of his allies, declared war on them. And in the 14th year they attacked and they were successful. And they looted the city of Sodom, along with the other 4 cities. They took all of their wealth, they took all of the women and children and any of the men that were left, and they took them captive. But one man escaped. And this man went to Abraham and he told him everything that had taken place. Look at verses 11 through 13. The victorious invaders then plundered Sodom and Gomorrah and headed for home, taking with them all the spoils of war and the food supplies. They also captured Lot, Abram's nephew, who lived in Sodom. And they carried off everything he owned. But one of Lot's men escaped and reported everything to Abram the Hebrew, who was living near the oak grove belonging to Mamre the Amorite. Mamre and his relatives, Eshcol and Aner, were Abram's allies. So Abraham mobilized his servants and he set out after the invading army. Look at verse number 14. When Abram heard that his nephew Lot had been captured, he mobilized the 318 trained men who had been born into his household. Then he pursued, I'm going to try and pronounce this again the way they say to pronounce it, Chedorlaomer's army until he caught up with them at Dan. Now, I want you to notice how wealthy Abraham was. I keep telling you that Abraham was a very wealthy man. Why do I say that? Well, let's listed some of his possessions. It tells us that the land could not sustain both his livestock and Lot's livestock, but we get even a greater clue when we read the story. Because I want you to notice that he had 318 trained men, military men, who had been born into his household. In other words, they were children of servants. Now, if there were 318 of them, that means that Abraham probably had well over 1,000 servants in his household. Because you're not counting females. You're not counting older men. You're not counting the male children who aren't old enough to go to war and those who weren't trained. You are only counting the young, trained men. So Abraham's camp was probably equivalent to a small town. Now you find out and you understand why when Abraham did move and Isaac did move, because he inherited all of this, certain people would come out and they would want to make covenants with him. Why did they want to make covenants with him? Because they perceived him to be a king. He ruled over his own little town. He had servants well over 1,000, and they were militarily trained. No wonder he was considered to be so wealthy. And that brings up another interesting point. Abraham's camp must have been very well organized. And the reason why I say that is because not only did the servants have normal duties, but they were also trained for military service. I want you to underline the word trained in that verse. Trained is translated from the Hebrew word kanik, which means trained for battle. Now, people, that's pretty impressive, because he had 300 servants who had been born in his household. He didn't acquire them, he didn't buy them, they didn't come to work for him, but they were born in his household, and they were trained to do battle. They were trained with weapons. So he had a very organized camp. And to me, that's pretty impressive. So Abraham chased this invading army all the way to Dan, and then he attacked at night. Now, normally you didn't attack at night. That wasn't something that you did because you don't have night goggles. You don't have any of the sophisticated weaponry we have today. And, you can't see where you're going. So why in the world did Abraham do that? Well, the reason that he attacked at night is because he wanted the cover of darkness. He didn't want the other invading armies because it was a coalition of 4 kings. And he is just one. So he has 318 men possibly chasing 4,000 or 5,000. But when he gets there, it's nighttime, and he splits his group into 2. And he attacks at night so they won't know how many men they have. And it happens just like Gideon's battle did. If you remember what Gideon did, he attacked at night. There were so many thousands of the Midianites, and so when Gideon gets there and he has 300 men, they get these lanterns and they get jugs and they attack at night and they crash these things, and he spreads these lights out, and as they come down the hills, it looks like there are thousands of them, and they panic and they start killing each other, trying to retreat. And that's exactly what Abraham did. He splits up his men and he says, I'll tell you what, when we get ready to attack, we're going to attack. And when you hear us yell, you come from the other direction, we'll come from this direction. They won't know how many men we are. Here, there, they don't even have their sentries up. And sure enough, they did this, and there was a panic. And they took off running. They left the loot there. They left the captives there. But because they had them on the run, Abraham chased them all the way to the area of Damascus. Now, if you're familiar with that area, that means he chased them a long ways. In fact, he actually made them hightail it out of there. Look at verse number 15. Let me go ahead and read this. There he divided his men and attacked during the night. Chedorlaomer's army fled, but Abram chased them as far as Hobah, north of Damascus. So Abraham rescued Lot as well as the others who had been taken captivity, and he recovered all of the loot. Now, as he was coming back victorious, he went to meet the king of Sodom, and where they met was known as the King's Valley. Look with me, if you would, in verses 16 and 17. Abram recovered all the goods that had been taken, and he brought back his nephew Lot with his possessions, and all the women and other captives. After Abram returned from his victory over Chedorlaomer and all his allies, the king of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Shaveh, that is the King's Valley. Now, does everyone know where the King's Valley is in Israel? How many of you have never even heard of the King's Valley? All right. The King's Valley is actually the Kidron Valley. How many have heard of the Kidron Valley? The Kidron Valley is the valley that's between the Mount of Olives and Jerusalem, the old city of Jerusalem. In fact, go ahead and, if you don't mind, put this back on the back wall of Jerusalem. Let me just show you where the Kidron Valley is. This is Jerusalem in the time of Jesus. This is after Herod the Great had built the Temple Mount. Here's the temple on this. And then this is how it expanded. And this is how big it was about at the time of Jesus Christ. Now, it wasn't that large when Abraham was there because, of course, who built the Temple Mount and put the temple on there? Solomon did. Did he make it as big as Herod the Great did? No. It was half the size of that. But there wasn't even a Temple Mount at the time that Abraham was there. There was only the little city known as Jerusalem. And we'll talk about that in just a second. It's this little bitty city. This little place right here was known as the city of David when David took it from the Jebusites. And that was all it was. What most people don't realize is that when Nehemiah came to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, he did not rebuild the walls of this city. When Nehemiah came and he rebuilt the walls, all he built was this little bitty place right here. Now, do you see that? That is the Kidron Valley, and this is the Mount of Olives. And the Mount of Olives runs all the way up here, all the way to Mount Scopus, which is north of the city of Jerusalem. Today, the Hebrew University sits up here on Mount Scopus. But the Mount of Olives is all right here, and in between the Mount of Olives and the Temple Mount is the Kidron Valley. That is the Valley of Kings. So when Abraham had conquered this invading army, sent them running, captured all the loot back, took the captives. He came back, he's coming back, and he comes to meet the king of Sodom. And where they meet is the Valley of the Kings. Now, the reason this is very important is because of who comes out to greet him. Yes, we know he's coming back, and we know that the king of Sodom is coming, but someone else comes out to meet him. Who is that person? Melchizedek. Look at verses 18 through 20. This is the first time we hear about this man called Melchizedek. And Melchizedek, the king of Salem, and a priest of God Most High, brought Abram some bread and wine. Melchizedek blessed Abram with his blessing. Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has defeated your enemies for you. Then Abram gave Melchizedek a tenth of all the goods he had recovered. Now, who is Melchizedek? How many of you are familiar with Melchizedek? You at least have heard of him. How many of you have heard of him, but you don't really know who he is? He's kind of this mysterious person in the Bible. But tonight we're going to go a little bit into that because to me it's an important part of the story. So if we want to know who Melchizedek is, we have to cheat. We have to go to the end of the book. Not all the way to the book of Revelation, but the book of Hebrews. How many of you like to read suspenseful novels? When you're reading those suspenseful novels and you think, oh no, the hero's going to die. I don't know how he can get out of this, or maybe he's going to go to jail or whatever. How many of you will cheat, turn to the back, and make sure it turns out all right before you keep reading? None of you? I have to admit, every once in a while, because I see so many bad things happen all the time, that if I'm reading a book and I think, this might not turn out good, I will turn to the back, and I will just to make sure that it turns out all right. He's not in prison, he didn't die, nothing bad happened to him. I'll read that little bit and go, okay, I can finish the book. Well, here Melchizedek comes on the scene. Now, this is a very mysterious person. And if I want to know about this guy, I'm going to cheat. Instead of just finding everything I can out about him in Genesis, I'm going to go to the New Testament and see what's written about him. And so we go to the book of Hebrews, because in the book of Hebrews, they're talking, he's concentrating on Jesus Christ as being our high priest. And in doing that, he's going to compare him to this man, Melchizedek. So turn with me to the book of Hebrews, the 7th chapter. I'm going to read verses 1 through 6, but it actually talks about him much more. It goes on to verse 10 and 11, I believe, but we're only going to cover the first 6 verses. Notice what it says. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name means king of righteousness. So if you're taking notes, write down Melchizedek means king of righteousness. So the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace, without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Just think how great he was. Even the patriarch Abraham gave a tenth of the plunder. Now the law requires the descendants of Levi who become priests to collect a tenth from the people, that is, their brothers, even though their brothers are descended from Abraham. This man, however, did not trace his descent from Levi, yet he collected a tenth from Abraham and blessed him who had promised. Now, let me turn your attention to what this passage of Scripture has to say about Melchizedek. First of all, he tells us what his name means. His name means king of righteousness. Then he goes further and says, but this is his title. What was his title? King of Salem. Now, does everyone know what the word Salem means? It means peace. It's actually a Sumerian word. It is not a Hebrew word. It's a Sumerian word. It means peace. The Sumerian word for city is Yeru. Yeru. Y-E-R-U. Now, when you combine Yeru with Salem, you get Jerusalem. Jerusalem. And Jerusalem means city of peace. Now, rabbis will get mad at each other, debate it, call each other names. Some say that the word shalom actually comes from that Sumerian word, and it comes from Salem because shalom means peace. But actually, if you want to know what Jerusalem, it is not Yerushalom. It is Jerusalem, a Sumerian word that means city of peace. Now, he says that Melchizedek is the king of righteousness, and he is the king of Salem, king of peace. Look at verses 1 and 2 in Hebrews chapter 7. This Melchizedek was king of Salem and priest of God Most High. He met Abraham returning from the defeat of the kings and blessed him. And Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. First, his name, Melchizedek, means king of righteousness. Then also, king of Salem means king of peace. So we know this as a fact because of what the book of Hebrews tells us. Secondly, this man has no father, mother, neither beginning of days nor end of days. Look at the first part of verse number 3 in Hebrews chapter 7. Without father or mother, without genealogy. Hey, let's try and trace this. There's nothing to trace. Without beginning of days or end of life. Now, is this guy starting to sound like someone? Is he? King of righteousness, king of peace. No beginning of days, no end of life. Wow. And last but not least, he's said to be like the Son of God. Look at the last part of verse 3. We just looked at the first part. Now let's look at the last part. Without father or mother, without genealogy, without beginning of days or end of life. Like the Son of God, he remains a priest forever. Now the majority of us don't understand this because we concentrate on the New Testament instead of the Old Testament. And because of that, we don't study many of the Christophanies in the Old Testament. Now, do you remember what a Christophany is? A Christophany is a revelation of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. It comes from the word Christ and phenia. Phenia means to reveal. So it's Christ revealing himself in the Old Testament. Everyone with me? Because before Abraham was, Jesus said, I am. Do you remember that? Jesus said, before Abraham was, I am. When Moses said, who do I say has sent me to Egypt? You tell him I am has. Jesus comes along and says, before Abraham even was, I am. In other words, I am God. Now, because we don't study the Old Testament like we ought to, we don't study Christophanies. But we miss out on something. Because before Jesus Christ actually came in the flesh, every time he appeared in the Old Testament, he was said to be like the Son of God. Let me give you an example. Turn to the book of Daniel, chapter 3, verse number 25. Now, in this particular story, you have Shadrach, Meshach, and if you grew up in Cherokee County, it's Abednego, right? It's not Abednego, the way it really says. It's Abednego. I don't know why, but maybe we can't pronounce Abednego, so we say Abednego. So you have the story of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. I'll just say it like we say it in Cherokee County. And they refuse to worship, and as a result of this, they get thrown in the fiery furnace. Now, when the king is looking, and he's looking inside this fiery furnace, and it's so hot that even the people who threw them in, guess what happens? They die from the heat. That heat is so intense that it sucks in, it literally burns their lungs, and they fall over dead. But they look inside this furnace, and they begin to see not just 3 people walking around, but there's a 4th man. Notice what it says in verse 25. He answered and said, Lo, I see 4 men loose, walking in the midst of the fire, and they have no hurt. In other words, they're not going, oh, ah! No, they have no hurt. They're just walking around. And the form of the 4th, in other words, what he looks like, the form of the 4th is like the Son of God. So who was the 4th man in the fire? Jesus Christ. This is a Christophany. This is a Christophania, a revelation of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. Then why was he said to be like the Son of God? Why didn't they just say, and he was the Son of God? Why did they say he was like the Son of God? I want you to think about this. Because the Bible says God is Spirit. And he that worships him must worship him in spirit and in truth. Before Jesus Christ came and was born of Mary, born of a virgin, walked this earth as a man, he was spirit. Now in the Old Testament, he revealed himself as a man. But how did he reveal himself? Well, you need to understand that until he came in the flesh, he would only appear temporarily. But every time he appeared, he was exactly like what he was when he came permanently. Did you catch what I said? In other words, when he revealed himself through these Christophanies, when it was a revelation of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament, he looked just like he did when he came to this earth as a man. So in the Old Testament, they would be talking about it. Now sometimes it'll talk about, the hair is white and white as snow, and they'll do this because there's a different picture of Jesus Christ after the resurrection. But as he came, it talks about, and he was like the Son of Man. So in his pre-incarnate appearances, he's said to be like the Son of God, and you'll see that often. That phrase will be used in these Christophanies. So, who is Melchizedek? Jesus Christ. As the book of Hebrews says, he's the King of righteousness, the King of peace. He has no human father or mother, no beginning of days, no end of days. And when he appeared to Abraham, he looked just like Jesus Christ did when he came as a man. So this is very important, and that's why we see this in the book of Hebrews. Now, there are conservative scholars, very well-respected conservative scholars, that don't believe that. They believe that Melchizedek was nothing more than a man. And the reason they believe that is because when they read the book of Hebrews, they see no genealogy. And they say, we have to translate this according to no genealogy. Because there's no genealogy, there's no father, there's no mother. We don't know when he was born and we don't know when he died, so there's no beginning and no end. And then they come in and they go a little bit further and they say, he was like the Son of God in the sense that he was both king and priest. You see, in the Old Testament, God said that those from the tribe of Levi would be the priest. Those that are descended from Aaron are going to be the priest. But those from the tribe of Judah will be the kings, and you did not mix king and priest. The Hasmonean period did, and that's why the Essenes went down to where we know as the Dead Sea Scrolls, down by the Dead Sea, and they refused to worship in the temple at that time. And the reason they did is because they said God said that the king and priest was not supposed to be the same. But here Melchizedek comes, and he is not only a king, but he's also the priest of the God Most High. And so they come in and say when Jesus came, he is not only the king from the tribe of Judah, but he's after the order of Melchizedek, and he's a priest forever. And I can see where they're coming from. The problem is, when you read this in the original Greek, it doesn't say record of genealogy. You have to add that. Basically, what it's telling you is no father, no mother, no genealogy. No number of days. No beginning, no end. And basically what he's telling you here is this is a revelation of Jesus Christ in the Old Testament. And that's what I believe. But if you believe the other, that's okay. I won't stone you for it. Now, let's get back to the story. What did Abraham do when Melchizedek came out to greet him? Because here he's coming back, and here's what's funny. If he'd wanted to go just to see go to see the king of Sodom, he would not have come this way. Why? Because if you're familiar with Israel, you go from Dan, you come right by the Sea of Galilee, and you travel right down the Jordan Valley. You just follow the Jordan River, and it's just as nice and easy as you can. You don't go back to the hill country because that's hard traveling. But Abraham doesn't do that. Why? Because it is not his intent to go see the king of Sodom. It's his intent to go see this man named Melchizedek. He's built an altar. He understands and recognizes that this is a priest of the God Most High. And so he wants to go and personally thank him and to do something very special for this person. And here's what's interesting. It is a witness because the king of Sodom realizes, oh, if I'm going to be an important part in the story, I have to go up here. And he comes and he gets to witness what Abraham does with Melchizedek. Now, what did Abraham do when Melchizedek came out to meet him? Oh, don't you just hate this? We're going to get on tithing. He gave a tenth of everything he owned. Now, in the book of Hebrews, I was reading the translation, the NLT, and it says of all the loot, but actually it doesn't say that in the original. It says he gave a tenth of everything he owned. Now, he gave a tenth of everything he owned. In other words, he tithed to him. Look at verses 19 and 20. And he blessed Abram, Melchizedek did, saying, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, creator of heaven and earth. El Elyon. That's the term that he uses in the original Hebrew. El Elyon. It means creator of everything. Melchizedek, with all of these people who believe in all these different gods, is not that way. He serves the same one true God that Abraham does. And he comes out and he blesses Abraham and says, By God Most High, creator of heaven and earth, creator of everything that you see, the only true God. And blessed be God Most High, who delivered your enemies into your hand. And he is recognizing that, and Abraham is recognizing that. That's why he comes to the site known as Jerusalem, the city of peace. He expects to see Melchizedek. And then it says, Abraham gave him a tenth of everything. Now, let me explain something about tithing. This wasn't something that, we're going to teach on Abraham. I'm going to teach on tithing. But it's here. And it's a wonderful time to teach on this because of when Abraham gave his tithes. Because every once in a while I'll hear someone say that tithing is Old Testament. And in the New Testament we're no longer under the law, so we don't have to tithe anymore. How many of you ever heard someone say that that's a Christian? Tithing is Old Testament. We're in the New Testament. It was part of the law. We're not under the law now, therefore we don't have to tithe. Well, people, that's not true. And Christians who say that basically are ignorant of what the Bible has to say about tithing. Now, I could literally teach a year on tithing and never exhaust all the material that's in the Bible. Basically the principle of tithing goes all the way back to the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. And if you've ever heard me teach on that, it's true. This is something that happened before the fall even took place. But anyways, technically, before there was ever a law, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob all tithed. Abraham tithed to Melchizedek. And we don't know who Isaac and Jacob tithed to, but we do know they tithed. The Bible tells us. Let me give you the instance of Jacob. Turn to Genesis chapter 28, verses 20 through 22. Then Jacob made this vow. Now you need to understand. Before I read this, let me say something you need to understand. Even when Isaac is born and he grows up, it says the God of Abraham. But it doesn't say the God of Abraham and Isaac until Isaac makes God his God. And then he becomes known as the God of Abraham and Isaac. After Jacob is born and becomes a man and even has a family, God is not referred to as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He's still only known as the God of Abraham and Isaac. He is only known as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when Jacob comes to the decision that God, El Elyon, Yahweh, is my God. I will serve him. When he makes that commitment, God is now known as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. Now, we are now at that place where Jacob makes God his God. So from now on, they're going to refer to God as the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob because of this vow. Then Jacob made this vow. If God will indeed be with me and protect me on this journey, and if he will provide me with food and clothing, and if I return safely to my father's home. Lots of conditions. How many of you have given God conditions? If you'll do this God and this God and this God, then. This is Jacob. Then the Lord will certainly be my God. Not just my father's God, Isaac. Not just my grandfather's God, Abraham, but he'll be my God. And this memorial pillar I have set up will become a place for worshiping God. And I will present to God a tenth of everything he gives me. Now, what does the word tithe mean? It means tenth. A tithe is a tenth. So basically he's saying, I will tithe of everything that God gives me. So before there was ever a law, before Moses gave the law, the patriarchs tithed. Tithing was just part of the law, but the reason it's part of the law is because tithing existed long before the law ever existed. Not only that, Jesus taught tithing. I hear people say all the time, well, Jesus never taught tithing. Good gosh. Read the Bible. Turn to Matthew 23:23. What sorrow awaits you, teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you are careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens. But you ignore the more important aspects of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. Now here's what he's saying. Man, you're keeping all these minute things. You're keeping the law of tithing. And so when you come to even these little herbs, you will come in and you'll make sure a tenth of it's going to go to God. You'll separate it out. Now notice what he says. You should tithe. Yes. But don't neglect the more important things. Now, Jesus could have said, tithing doesn't matter. Don't tithe. That's Old Testament. I've come to usher in the principles of the new kingdom. I've come to usher in the New Testament. You don't tithe. But Jesus didn't say that. What did Jesus say? You should tithe. Yes. Wow. How many of you know that Paul taught tithing? Paul taught tithing. Turn to Romans chapter 2, verse number 22. He's getting on to the Jews. Why is he getting on to the Jews? He's getting on to the Jews because they want to be teachers of the Gentiles. And he says, that's good, but do you practice what you preach? And then he starts giving examples of, you preach this, but do you practice it? So notice what he says in verse 20. You say a man should not commit adultery. Do you commit adultery? You abhor idols, but do you commit sacrilege? What does that word sacrilege mean? Well, I can tell you what it means from the original Greek word that it's translated from. The word sacrilege is translated from the Greek word hieros uleo, which means to rob God. So what he says is, do you abhor idols? Do you teach people to abhor idols? Yes. But you commit sacrilege. You rob God. Now, how do you rob God, people? How can you rob God? Can any of you go up to heaven and steal something from the temple in heaven? Have you ever stolen something from God's throne? Have you ever stolen anything from God up in heaven? So how do you rob God? Well, Malachi chapter 3, verse number 8 tells us, will a man rob God? Yet you rob me. But you ask, how do we rob you? In tithes and offerings. So here's what's interesting. Everyone knew what Paul was talking about. Paul's in here and saying, you teach all these things, but you don't even do it. And why would Paul be saying this? Because he's writing to the ones in Romans. Because he's in Rome, and he's been at Corinth and all of these different places. And he said, you're teaching all these things. I wanted to teach my people, but you know what? I don't see any of your money coming in. Do you commit sacrilege? Do you rob from God? And they knew exactly what he was talking about. He was talking about Malachi chapter 3, verse number 8. So Paul also taught tithing. As we go through and look at all the scriptural things that he taught on finances, we find all through his epistles that he's alluding to giving. And the reason he didn't have to come tithing, because that is just a known fact that if you love God, that's what you're going to do. Now, this is very important. Because what we see when we begin to look at the differences between Abraham's character and Lot's character, Lot was after number one, and he wanted money. So he goes to a place he shouldn't do. He becomes involved and becomes a part of all of these ungodly people, and eventually he becomes just like them. But it's okay because he wants the lifestyle in the world that they have, not Abraham. He goes to the hill country. Why does he do that? Because he wants clear-cut boundaries. Yes, they're my neighbors. Yes, I want to be a witness to them. Yes, we're going to have interaction with them. But I want to have clear-cut boundaries because I do not want to associate and allow their ungodly habits to become my ungodly habits. And the first thing that he does when he goes after all of the loot and all of the captives that were taken from Sodom and Gomorrah, he doesn't head back and give it back to them because he doesn't want to pay homage to them. Do you realize he didn't go back to Sodom? He goes to the city of peace. Melchizedek comes out because he's coming to him. And the first thing he wants to teach his nephew Lot is you give your part to God. Get out from among these ungodly people. You know what's right. And you give to God what is God's. And that's the character of Abraham. Will Lot learn that? No. He goes back to Sodom because that's a world that he wants. Abraham stays in Hebron. Abraham is blessed. Lot eventually loses everything he has, including his family and his self-dignity, and actually has an incestuous relationship with his daughters. All because he did not do what Abraham told him to do. And what Abraham was doing when he came to Jerusalem was a living example of, Lot, pay attention. This is the God we serve. The reason we're blessed is because God has given us that. Everything I own, I'm giving a tenth to him because it's God who has blessed me.